I'm going to show you how to bind a quilt using strips of fabric that you've cut yourself and binding the edges of the quilt together. So the first step is to cut strips of fabric that are 2.5 inches wide, and we need to inevitably join some strips together to get your continuous piece to go round the whole quilt. So if you get two ends of different strips and you're going to put them right sides together at right angles to each other. So I know you can't tell which is the right side or the wrong side of this white fabric, but I'm pretending that these two are the right side. So you put right sides together at right angles to each other. Just going to pop a couple of clips there. And then you're going to sew across the diagonal in this direction. So from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner. That's going to be your sewing line. So if you sew down that line to join the strips. So here I have sewn down my sewing line, and then we're going to trim the seam allowance to about 1 centimetre. And then you are going to press the seam open on the other side like so, and then carry on and join as many strips as you need to go round the circumference of your quilt. Then once you've joined your strips together, you're going to fold your strip in half so that the wrong side and the joined up seams are on the inside. So you're going to have your right side facing out. I've now got my folded over strip of fabric ready to bind the quilt with. I'm going to aim for my join to be somewhere around in the centre of this sampler. So I want to leave about a 4-inch tail here to allow for a sufficient overlap so that when we come round back to the beginning we've got some flexibility to join the strips with. So what I'm going to do is clip this strip. So what I'm doing is I'm matching up the raw edges of the tape, so your folded over strip of fabric, to the raw edges of the one edge of the quilt. And then what we're going to do is we're going to leave this bit nice and free of stitching because we're going to need to be able to get that under the sewing machine towards the end. So round about here I am going to sew a line of stitching 1/4 inch away from the edge, and I'm going to stop 1/4 inch away from the final edge of the quilt, and then I'm going to leave my needle down in the machine, lift the press foot up and pivot, and then I'm going to sew off the fabric at an angle, so you're sewing towards the corner of the quilt underneath. This is going to help prepare us for our mitered corners. So I have sewn down 1/4 inch from the raw edge, stopped 1/4 inch from the end, and pivoted to sew off the fabric towards the corner. I'm now going to move my fabric around and we're going to prepare our strip of fabric to do our mitered corner. So taking the long loose end of your tape, we're going to take your strip of fabric up away from the quilt, and you should see that the line of your tape should now line up with the next edge of your quilt, and you've got this kind of triangular section here. Keep your finger on this triangle here and bring your strip of fabric back down on itself, lining up the top and the new edge here. So you've got this sort of flappy triangle here. We're just going to keep it down at the moment, and then we're going to clip that in place. We're now going to sew right from the top, 1/4 inch away from the edge, down this side until you get to 1/4 inch away from the edge, about here, and then you're going to pivot and sew off the edge of the fabric. Like so. So as you can see, I've sewn all the way down the second edge, stopped 1/4 inch from the edge of the next edge of the quilt, and then pivoted and gone off to the corner. So I'm going to move my quilt round again to do my second mitered corner. So I take this long loose end and I take it up away from the quilt. So I've got this triangle here. I keep my finger on the triangle and then I take my strip of fabric down to line up with the new edge of the quilt. And I do the same process down this edge. I will do my mitered corner here, turn around, take it down to this edge, do the corner, and then I will finish off stitching round about here, so that we've then got the flexibility to join the two ends of the fabric together. So I've done my final corner here and finished off at this point here. So we've now got to join these two pieces of fabric together. So what I'm going to do is overlap the two pieces so I can mark where my overlap is going to be. So say it's going to be there. That's where my pieces are going to overlap. So just transferring those lines here. So I know I can take off that bit here because I know that that bit's just going to be in the way. So that's where we're going to join our two pieces. Okay, so we're going to open these two pieces out and we're going to place these two pieces right sides together, being careful not to twist them. So I want my lines to be on top of each other. I'm going to put a clip where my line is. Now the trick is that we're going to stitch down this line and it needs to be as smooth as possible. It's probably one of the trickiest bits because you're kind of attached here and you're trying to get these two pieces as flat as possible. I'm just going to put a little mark here and here so I know where my stitching line is going to be. So I'm now going to join these two pieces together by stitching along this line. So I have sewn down this line, joining the two pieces together, and then I will trim off the excess to about 1 centimetre seam allowance. And then when I pull the sides of the strips of fabric out, this then neatly comes in on itself, closing the gap. I then need to make sure it's lining up with the raw edge of the fabric, and I will begin where I stopped with my line of stitching and just close that gap 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So my binding is now attached at the raw edge all the way round. So now what we need to do is to take the binding to the other side, poking the corners through. So at this corner, you can see here we've got a nice mitered corner. So the aim is on the back of your quilt, you're going to want to use your binding to cover the stitching at the side along all 4 sides. That needs to be hidden. So I'm going to go around and make sure that that binding is covering the stitching. Trying to make sure that the binding is equal all the way round. At the corners, you will be folding the fabric like so. Just going to turn those round so they're like this. So that's from the back and this is from the front. So you would carry on and do that all the way round. Once you have done that, you are ready to stitch down the back of this bias binding, and there's a couple of different ways to do this. The first is by the machine and the second is by hand. To sew it by machine, we're going to sew from the right side of your quilt. You're going to sew in the seam that is created by the quilt and your binding, and this is known as stitching in the ditch. So the idea is that you stitch right along that seam line in the join between the two, so that on the other side you are catching this piece of fabric. So I will take it to the machine and show you that now. So along this section I have stitched along the ditch. Now just try and get as close into the ditch as possible. There may be certain sections, like here I just came ever so slightly onto the binding, but I'm using a matching colour to the binding, so that doesn't really bother me. You may have different threads poking out, just get rid of those. So that is it from the right side. So you may see a tiny bit of stitching depending on how straight your stitching was. And then from the back you get the back piece of binding caught nicely there. But you do get that visible line of stitching from the reverse. So the second option would be to hand stitch it using a slip stitch, and I will show you that now. So with the slip stitch I have just secured my thread underneath the binding, so that it's secure. I'm not going through all the layers, I've just picked up a little bit of the backing fabric. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your needle into the fold of the binding, and then you pick up a few fibres from your backing fabric, so you're not going all the way through. And then I would go along the fold again and the backing fabric. Lots of ends in the way. So as you can see, it's a lot neater than the machine finish, but it is obviously more time consuming. But this way you get a pretty invisible finish on your binding, and you won't see the stitches from the front side. So that's hand finishing your quilt.